Shinji Mikami is one of the living legends currently in video games. After joining Capcom in 1990, the man would go on to create the iconic Resident Evil franchise, the Dino Crisis series, God Hand, and produce games like Devil May Cry, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, and Killer 7, which he also helped write. But before he directed Resident Evil, there were two games he designed for Capcom. One was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the other was a Super Nintendo game, a game whose influence in the Resident Evil series is still felt to this very day.
Report to the Goof Troop.
Yeah. Hear me out. Shinji Mikami designed Goof Troop 3 years before directing Resident Evil, and his only credit between the two is for a planner on Disney's Aladdin. So somehow, a natural evolution for Mikami was from Goof Troop to Resident Evil 1. His co-designer, Satoshi Murata, would also go on to work on Resident Evil, so in theory, there has to be something that gave them the idea for Resident Evil while making this goofy game, right? That's what I'm going to show you today. Recently, I forced my friend Kalamity Kaiju to play through the entirety of Goof Troop with me on his Twitch stream. You can check out the full stream on his Twitch archive channel, or check the VOD at twitch.tv/Kalamity Kaiju. It was especially fun for me because I have a lot of nostalgia for Goof Troop. It was one of those quintessential childhood games I played over and over as a kid. Goof Troop is loosely based on the Disney cartoon of the same name. It stars America's dad, Goofy, and his son, Max. In the show, the pair would typically get caught in wacky suburban hijinks that would often involve their neighbor Pete and his family, his wife and god-tier furry bait Peg, his son Pete Jr. or PJ, and his daughter Pistol. It's a pretty alright one of the classic Disney afternoon lineup shows. And it would later go on to spawn a Goofy movie, which is objectively the best Disney animated film of all time and is literal perfection. The game Goof Troop was released in 1993 as one of the many Disney games that Capcom would so often make around this era. Seemingly just made as a piece of merchandise for the show, as it came less than 1 year after the show aired, there's not a lot of information out there about the making of Goof Troop. Maybe one day we'll get a great no-clip documentary about the grueling, fire-forged development of the magnum opus that is Goof Troop, but so far no such luck. Goof Troop begins with a teeny bit of story to show us where our father and son duo will be exploring. Unlike the show, the game is not a suburban adventure, it's a pirate adventure. On a lazy afternoon in Spoonerville, Goofy, Max, Pete, and PJ have all gone fishing in the ocean. When trying to land the big one, Pete and PJ end up encountering a giant pirate ship, and the pirates kidnap them for an unknown reason. Being the good neighbor he is, Goofy enlists the help of Max to row out to where the pirate ship took them, Spoonerville Island, and that is where the adventure begins. In the water, on the way to the island, rowing in the tiny boat, they encounter something they never expected.
Hey, you know, maybe we ought to go find Leon. Hey-o! Hey-o! Ow-wah!
Nah, I'm just kidding. They get to the shore and head out. The first of 5 levels is set on a beach and the beach's surrounding area. You get immediate control over whichever character you picked at the beginning, but this is where a good playthrough of Goof Troop is separated from a bad one. Adapting the idea of the show's 2 lead characters, Goof Troop on SNES is a co-op game with simultaneous 2-player action. One player controls Goofy and the other controls Max. They have very slight differences, a la Donkey Kong Country, but they can do all of the same things that involve progression. When you're playing by yourself, there's only one of these goofs around, and in my opinion, it makes the game really boring to play. That's why, as previously mentioned, I forced my buddy Kalamity Kaiju to play with me. As you explore, you come across various items, the first one being the grapple gun that you find on the screen to the right. Each character can only hold 1 item at a time. If you're not playing in co-op, you can hold 2 at the same time, but the uses for each item can vary wildly. The grapple gun, for instance, can be used to kill smaller enemies, stun larger ones, reach items that would normally be out of reach, and a secret thing I'll tell you about later. There are, in essence, only 3 major mechanics in this game in terms of player control and interface. You can pick up these items, which have their own small uses. You have the ability to pick up objects and throw them, which is the main way you'll be killing enemies. And you can kick blocks, which can also be used to defeat enemies and will be used to solve puzzles. The thing about Goof Troop that is interesting is that it truly defies genres. One can only describe this game as a puzzle adventure, but there aren't a lot of games you can even compare it to. It being top-down and focused on puzzle and item progression, the closest thing to compare it to is The Legend of Zelda, I suppose, which, honestly, I do really appreciate. This game could have easily just been a simple two-player platformer in the same vein as most of Capcom's other Disney games. But Shinji Mikami actually did something pretty interesting, and I'd argue with no hyperbole that he adapted the spirit of the show well. Pretty much every story featuring these two characters is about them putting aside their differences and learning to enjoy each other's company or simply respect each other. So putting the players in a similar position is a pretty cool idea for such a simple game. The players have to work together to coordinate items and solve puzzles while protecting each other all the while. In fact, I feel like the target audience for people playing this game is specifically fathers and sons playing together, which is why I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to Kaiju for being my dad for 2 hours. As you go about the first level and explore the different screens, you come across more items. The bell, which is used to lure enemies to your location, the plank, which is used to fill holes in bridges, the small key, which opens silver doors, and the boss key, which opens, you guessed it, boss doors. Since you can only carry one item at a time, you have to decide among yourselves which has to be the progression item carrying lackey. In our playthrough, Kaiju decided to put me, his poor underage son, to work in grueling manual labor, enslaving me to carry all keys and boards that we came across. One day, Max will rise up and take the Goof name by the reins in glorious revolution. But today is not that day. Oh, also, there's a shovel item in this level. It's a very optional item that can only be used in these specific patches of dirt. You use the shovel to dig up things like fruit for health and extra lives and continues. Theoretically, you could also use it to grind out lives until you hit the max, but a pro gamer like me doesn't need any of that crap. To me, these items make it clear as day how we go from Goof Troop to Resident Evil. The keys are obvious. Resident Evil is completely filled to the brim with all sorts of keys to open specific doors and progress the game. The other 3 items, though, create a really interesting, very survival horror relationship with the player, and it's especially interesting as a co-op game. The grappling gun is obviously, as of right now, purely an offensive item, with the added bonus to grab out of reach optional items. The bell is not directly an offensive item, it's more proactive in offense. You use the bell to lure enemies to you, and the game encourages you to do so in a way that sets up their defeat. There's a bit at the very end of the first level, right before the boss, where you're given 3 large enemies, a narrow pathway, no throwables, and a single block to kick. There's also a bell freely given in the bottom left. Game design is telling you that all of these things were deliberately put here to be used in tandem. Set up the block to trap the enemies in the corridor, then use the bell to lure them over in front of the block. Kick the block down the narrow corridor, and boom, 3 enemies dead. This shows, if you haven't figured it out by this point, how useful the bell can be in not killing enemies, but setting them up to be killed in ways that you normally wouldn't think of. This is especially great in co-op because one person can set up the block while the other keeps the enemies in one spot with the bell. The last item is the wooden plank. There are no uses for this item whatsoever except for filling a spot in a bridge, and in the first level there is only the single spot that needs to be filled. That means that for progression, for a time, a player has to use their inventory slot to carry the plank so that you can finish the level. You could say that these 3 items illustrate the game's goal, to have you as the player manage items in a limited inventory, balancing offense and progression. Just like another Shinji Mikami series of games, right? The one thing that separates that kind of strategizing from Resident Evil, however, is the fact that the enemies in Goof Troop respawn upon resetting the screen. In Resident Evil, most zombies stay dead once you kill them, a testament to the upgraded power of the PlayStation 1, no doubt. In Goof Troop, you're not as incentivized to favor offense over progression due to that. You can't take a grappling gun to help clear out enemies, then return with a progression item once enemies are cleared out so you can progress easier. However, that concept can still be seen in its infancy in Goof Troop. As you progress through the game, they start putting enemies in puzzle rooms. If you have items that help you with offense, you can make the puzzle much easier by getting rid of enemies first, then taking all the time you need on puzzles. Some enemies and hostile obstacles are undefeatable, however, meaning that certain puzzle rooms will ask you to be on the move while thinking. Once you solve all the puzzles for progression in the first level and get the boss key, you can head over for the first boss, the Jester Hole. I don't like that name one bit. Jester Hole is a simple boss. These funny men will pop out of these whack-a-mole holes and toss various items at you. Bombs, mainly, but also barrels and spiked balls. You have to catch or pick up the bombs and barrels and toss them back, hitting the funny boys with said items. They'll increase in speed as you go, but once you hit the last one, it's over and the stage is cleared. The second stage puts Goofy and Max into a mountainside village further into the island. Nothing major changes about how you go through this level. You just want to get through each screen alive, solve the puzzles, find the progression items, and fight the boss. This stage to me is what really helps highlight the difference between Max and Goofy as playable characters. I mentioned it before, but it's not really a big deal. Max is very slightly faster than Goofy. Max is constantly sprinting, while Goofy is taking everything in a light stride. So that's Max's advantage. Goofy, being older and larger, has the strength advantage. When Max throws a throwable at a larger variant of an enemy, it will simply stun lock them and he has to hit them a second time to actually defeat them. Goofy has no such limit. If Goofy throws something at the larger enemy, they'll die in one hit. This is an interesting character trait because it not only makes sense logically due to the aforementioned size difference, but it's something of a running theme with Goofy as a character. Ever since his earliest incarnations, Goofy has always been a consistent source of outlandish slapstick and physical humor for Disney. A lot of his old cartoon shorts feature him in typically a modern setting, doing something we do in everyday life, but messing it up in a cartoony and comedic way. This extends into even movies starring Goofy and, of course, the Goof Troop cartoon. When there isn't interpersonal character drama happening, usually it's Goofy getting into a severe and terrifying accident, but shrugging it off with minor injuries. This implies that Goofy is a man of great endurance and strength, which is often portrayed in video games as him being a stronger character. Even Kingdom Hearts has this, where Goofy is specifically not a sword fighter or a mage, but a defensive knight, a tank. He's decked out completely in armor when defending Disney Castle, and his weapon of choice is a shield. Most of Goofy's abilities in Kingdom Hearts also involve defense in some way, like protecting allies from damage or teaming up with him, having Sora stand behind him and the two rush forward together. He's also given more HP than either Sora or Donald, further emphasizing that he's the tank in the RPG party comp, or, in Final Fantasy job terms, he would be a defender. This gives Sora a great balance in his party, and even though the party member AI isn't great by any means, there is usually enough there on a per-battle basis that showcases Donald's magic and Goofy's strength, letting Sora be the all-rounder. Once Sora and his gang arrive in Hollow Bastion, the game pulls a fast one on you though. Riku shows up and steals the Keyblade from Sora. Because their whole mission up to this point was to simply follow whoever held the Keyblade, Donald and Goofy decide to stop following Sora and follow Riku. This leaves Sora with nothing. No Keyblade, no Donald, no Goofy, only a wooden sword and his new buddy, the Beast. Sora can still attack with the wooden sword, but the damage he puts out is pathetic, so you have to rely on the Beast, and I think I've gotten off track. Sorry. Stage 2 of Goof Troop. This stage introduces a new concept wherein you must use the grappling gun as a progression item by lining up 2 link points and making a tightrope. That's the secret function I mentioned earlier. It's a really cool evolution to me because you spend the entire first level learning about its use in combat and use for getting optional goodies, but then this level shows you a whole new use you hadn't even considered. But it still makes sense because it's a grappling gun, something that, when shown to you, you logically expect it to be used to grapple places. Another new concept introduced in this level are bomb blocks. There's these blocks with little green lights on them that, when kicked, will begin to blink before turning yellow over time, then red, then finally exploding. Introduced on the same screen are these prick enemies that also know how to kick blocks and will use this against you. You don't actually need these blocks for anything or to even kill the enemies on this screen. It's just kind of introducing the concept to you. Like, old Capcom Mega Man style game design. That's always really fun to see. 2 screens ahead, however, you have to do a block puzzle with this enemy type in the way, and that can get a little frustrating. Without a bell to lure them to you, it's a crapshoot when they'll decide to kick these blocks around, and one bad kick can force you to reset the room. If you get lucky though, you can take them out quickly and then just focus on the puzzle. There are no new items introduced on the second level. The whole thing is just kind of a natural evolution of the first, offering tougher enemies and slightly more difficult puzzles. The final screen before the boss door introduces a new enemy type, and these guys are extra annoying here because there is no way to kill them. They roll forward in a ball and will run you down like roadkill. If you don't have a grapple gun to stun them, the way you get around them is to make them charge you down the pathway, hide in this groove here, and run past. Once you're past them, it's time for the second boss, Firebug. Firebug is a pretty simple boss. He's just one guy. He moves around and blows fire, and you want to simply not get hit by him. There's a couple of barrels offered at the start of the fight you can hit him with, and if you run out, minions will appear on either side of the screen to toss extra at you that you can catch and hit him with. Once he goes down, it's on to level 3, the Spooky Castle. Aesthetically, this level is the most unique of all 5 levels in this game, and it being a medieval castle on an island in a Shinji Mikami game, it's once again not hard to draw Resident Evil parallels. You even got the knights who attack you, the cult members, and the horrible mutants. It's here we're introduced to the final item in the game, the candle. It does exactly what you would expect from a game like this. It makes dark areas easier to see. This is probably my biggest complaint about the game, and something I wish were done just a little differently. The small amount of items is fine, but I wish they had more uses each. Every item except the grappling hook only does one thing, and I just wish a couple of them had 1 or 2 extra ways to be used. The plank and the bell can stay the same, and so can the keys. Mainly, I wish the shovel had more use than just these scattered patches of dirt, because they're only in the first 3 levels and never seen again. Maybe if you used it outside of the patches of dirt, you could create pits that enemies could fall into. I'm just spitballing here. It would have just been nice to see is all. If you wanted to use the shovel for progression, maybe there are some spots where you have to dig up a key or something. Just, come on man, give me a reason to use the shovel more than the optional goodies that I might not even need if I'm good enough at the game. The candle, too, could be used for secrets and progression by maybe burning things away like cobwebs or curtains or what have you. I just think the grappling gun being introduced with one thing in level 1 and then getting an entirely new use in level 2 is really cool to see, and it would have been nice to see that happen 1 or 2 more times. I guess I can't complain that much though. The game is only 2 hours long. This level's a lot bigger than the previous ones, but also more linear. There's not as much backtracking for progression in this one. You just kind of make your way through the castle fighting the previously mentioned haunted knights and trying not to get squished by rolling balls that look straight out of A Link to the Past. There is one puzzle that you come across where you have to spell a password to open the door. It took Kaiju and me a few good hours to figure out this one, but once we got it done, we were able to move on. Finally, you reach this very not intimidating room with a closing wall, and then you fight the level 3 boss, the red skeleton and the blue skeleton. Wonder how long it took them to come up with those names. These two will throw bones at you, and when they stop, the bones can be picked up and thrown back for damage. Contrary to what you might think with the bones and the bosses being color-coded, you don't actually have to hit the skeletons with either their corresponding color or the opposite color, which I think would have been a fun touch had they done that. After you do enough damage to one of the skeletons, they'll begin to throw their head at you, and their body will be invincible for that time, but the head can still be hit. Hit them with enough of their own bones, and they go down. Level 4 is inside the island mountains, or maybe a volcano or something. This level is a bit boring aesthetically since it's mostly brown and gray, but there are still some interesting screens, like some rooms being made entirely out of ice, with accompanying physics. The physics aren't really all that hard to get around, so they don't add too much of a challenge. Even in the part where you have to hit all of the buttons in the room within a short amount of time, the ice is a minor obstacle at best. Also introduced in this level are bomb walls, used only 2 or 3 times in this level and never again. The most interesting thing about this level is that it requires you to do block puzzles with bomb blocks, meaning that once you initiate the puzzle by kicking the block into position, You only have a certain amount of time before the bomb blows up and you have to reset the puzzle. I really like this element. It really raises the stakes and agency in the puzzles that you may have gotten a bit used to from the first 3 levels. There's a puzzle a bit into this level that requires the use of regular blocks and bomb blocks to solve, which I'll admit, after a few of the more brain-dead puzzles and enemy encounters behind us, this puzzle was decently exhilarating. It started working a few of those brain gears in a fun way that felt pretty satisfying to complete with the limited time available. There's another puzzle a bit further up that requires you to blow open a hole with a bomb block to put 2 regular blocks in place, but I always just reset the room after blowing up the space since the exploded passage stays, and then I just use the limited bomb block in the puzzle solution. I don't think I've ever solved this puzzle in the correct way, but I do appreciate that there are typically multiple ways to solve these puzzles. There's also minecarts on this level that fit aesthetically and you can ride in them, but they only show up a few times and I don't think you ever need to ride in them. I'm not exactly sure why they're even here since you can barely do anything with them, but they do give you a free way to kill enemies provided they're standing on the tracks awaiting their fate. The boss of this level is called, wait for it, Red Worm and Green Worm. They come in and out of these holes on the edges of the arena and will cause stalactites to drop that you can pick up and hit them with. It's a simple boss fight and arguably easier than the Jester Hole. After you defeat them, you head into the last level, and it's at this point that the full gripping story has been revealed. Turns out these pirates run under a captain named Keelhaul Pete, who has no relation seemingly to our friend Pete, but they sure look similar. Keelhaul Pete was recently lost at sea and swallowed by a whale, and unsure if he was dead or not, the pirates had begun to look for him. When they found Pete and PJ fishing, they thought that he may have been Keelhaul Pete and maybe just had some amnesia or something, and kidnapped him to bring him on board as their captain. They treated both pretty well, until Keelhaul Pete himself actually made it out of the whale and runs into Goofy and Max. Goofy brains the poor bastard, knocking him out cold, and that's when Goofy and Max figure out that the pirates think their Pete is the captain, and they're not going to be happy when they find out he isn't. They rush onto the pirate ship to save their neighbors, and we end up in the last level of the game. Level 5 is on the pirate ship we've been hearing so much about. In essence, it's made to throw everything you've previously used and learned at you. Almost every item can be found here, and so can every pirate enemy type. There's also plenty of block puzzles featuring both regular blocks and bomb blocks. Some of the hardest puzzles in the game can be found here, with the hardest, in my opinion, being the very last puzzle that you do, which I think is just good game pacing. There's also this new mechanic introduced that involves throwing a barrel or other throwable item onto a pressure block. That tripped me up for a little bit when I did it and almost immediately forgot it was a thing you could do. So when it asked me to do it later, I didn't think about it at first, wasting a good 5 or 10 minutes not progressing. At one point in the dark, you can find Keelhaul Pete's treasure room with an abundance of gold and jewels. This is Goofy's final trial, seeing if he can overcome the temptation of riches and wealth far beyond what he knows. Both him and Max pass, however, as they completely avoid even touching the treasure, focusing solely on their goal of rescuing Pete and PJ. Once you get the boss key, you use it on this fence, but it doesn't open directly to the boss. You go through one short final gauntlet featuring cannons, tightropes, and as I said, what is, in my opinion, the hardest puzzle in the game. Once that's finished, you have 2 options, progression and an optional room that you can go into featuring something. We didn't go into it in our playthrough, so we will never know what's in there, and I refuse to look it up to keep the sanctity of our canon playthrough. The other room is a small room where you have to gun down goons with a cannon, and when you progress past it, you're in the final boss room. Looks like Keelhaul Pete woke up and made it to the ship, and he is not happy. This boss definitely has a difficulty spike worthy of Capcom's stamp of approval. This dude throws everything at you. Bombs, fast spinning around the arena, shooting you with an actual gun, and summoning mobs to try and take you out. The best way to deal with Keelhaul Pete is to avoid all damage as best as you can, of course, and try to take out enemies as quickly as possible to avoid the extra pressure. The thing that's really tricky is that there's only 2 things here that can defeat the individual enemies. The bombs that Pete throws out, and the gun he shoots, which splits into 4 other bullets. Luring enemies into the bullets can be tricky since you often have to place yourself in the line of danger and then react quickly so the enemy can't move out of the way. The bombs are a bit safer, but only just a bit. If you're too close when an enemy is hit by a bomb, that will also cause you damage. On top of this, Killhall Pete can only be damaged by the bombs, and he doesn't always throw them out. If he touches you at all, in his spin move, or even if he's just standing still, he'll do damage to you. He even has a move where he extends his hook and pulls you towards him that you have to rock the D-pad to get out of. All in all, this is definitely the most chaotic this game ever gets, and this boss poses a pretty genuine, decent challenge. He also has more health than any of the previous bosses, which makes this a bit harder. Once you shove enough bombs down his gullet though, it's over and you win. Goof Troop has been completed. Goofy and Max rescue Pete and PJ, and the four take part in some lighthearted bonding over torturing Killhall Pete. You get a weirdly edited final sequence showing the quote-unquote cast of the game, and finally credits, where we see our boy in all his glory. Humble beginnings, as this little credit would later go on to be placed on some of the greatest games ever made. On a personal level, with me growing up to love Resident Evil and 4 being genuinely top 10 of all time material for me, and playing and enjoying games like Vanquish, Shadows of the Damned, and Evil Within, it's really cool to see that Shinji Mikami has constantly changed and evolved in making his games in the same way that I have changed and evolved my playing of them. He's not the only one I feel this way about, since there's other devs like Miyamoto, Iwata, Aonuma, Kojima, and more, but it's always something pretty cool and special, I think, to have a game developer that has been with you essentially your entire life playing games. Over decades, Shinji Mikami has given me some of my best game memories and experiences, and I thank him for that. It's clear even playing this game what Shinji Mikami enjoys doing with his game design. He enjoys making games that require consistent thinking ahead, consideration of resources in the name of progression, and solving puzzles. The ideas present in this simple Disney cartoon game would later go on to not necessarily invent, but establish and make popular the entire genre of survival horror. It's pretty funny to me that it's not hyperbole to say that Resident Evil wouldn't be half of what we know it as today if it wasn't for Goofy. It's clear from just playing a few of his games how much of Shinji Mikami's DNA is in Goof Troop, and seeing where he took some of the ideas and went to refine them is genuinely fascinating to see from a historical standpoint. When it's all said and done, Goof Troop is a fun little puzzle game. It certainly doesn't overstay its welcome. Kaiju and I finished the game in under 2 hours according to its end screen. But from what we played, I definitely had a great time and will probably continue to revisit this game again and again every few years. It's not the kind of game to set the world on fire, and it's probably not going to blow anyone's minds outside of the trivia that Shinji Mikami designed it. But for a cute, short little co-op adventure, I think it's easy to recommend if you ever want something retro and laid back. I do think there's a little bit of funny irony in it as well, that one of Mikami's first games was a 2-player puzzle adventure with Resident Evil's design elements, yet he left Capcom before the actual co-op Resident Evil game. As I said, I think Shinji Mikami is the kind of game designer that we should celebrate and track historically what his influences were. However, I don't think Shinji Mikami is alone in having games like Goof Troop that you can go back to and check the influences of. I think it's really cool as a fan of video games to go back and check the historical influences from game designers who are famous for certain franchises but maybe didn't start with those franchises. In fact, one example for myself that I've yet to actually play is a game called Marvelous Mohitotsu no Takurajima, which was Eiji Aonuma's first game. Eiji Aonuma, of course, would later go on to direct, produce, and be the face of the Legend of Zelda franchise. Maybe I'll even do a video on Marvelous in the future. But until then, thanks for watching. And I thought I would have a better ending at this point, but I don't.